Hello, I'm Annie from HoopSisters, and in this video I'm going to show you how to do block 3 and block 17 in our freshly picked quilt. So it's behind me. I'm going to step out of the way so you can take a look at it. So if you're watching us on a Facebook Live, say hello, tell us where you're from. And if you're going to be making this block, post pictures of your fabrics and your blocks along the way, because we would love to see what your quilt looks like as you make it. So the first thing you're going to need to make this is you're going to have to print off the fabric and thread key. So here you can see this is the quilt behind me without the border, and you can see the different fabrics that I picked out. That's just to show you kind of the colors that I used in case you wanted to do it somewhat like it. On the next page, it shows the same thing, but it shows the border that's also added. And so you'll need to pick out whether you're going to do this with or without a border so that you get the right fabric. And the following page, it's going to talk about what you want to do on the back of your quilt. So you can choose to add your backing while it's still in the hoop. There's a step for that. But if you'd rather join it in sections like it shows here, then don't add the backing. Skip over that step, and we have a slideshow with step-by-step pictures to show you how to do this. And your design will also come with all those cute little floral appliques in with the design. So if you wanted to really spice up the back like we did, you can certainly do that, or put it on anything else. So the quilt, let me show you. So you can see how we just joined 4 patch sections together and then backed each section after we added some applique embroidery, and then joined the quilt together and covered our raw edges with sashing. So that's how we did that one. So that's another decision you'll have to make, how you're going to back it, and that is going to affect how much fabric you buy. So we give you in the fabric and thread key little swatch sheet so you can put all your fabric there. To find out the number of the yardage and stuff though, you will have to go to a different sheet. And you can transfer that information on here, but it was too much information for us to put 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 inch size blocks. So just grab this sheet when you go shopping for fabric, and also pick the sheet that says with or without border, whichever one you're going to do. And then this is 9, 8, 7, 6, and 5 inch blocks. So for these videos, I'm going to be doing the 5 inch blocks. That's the 7 inch block behind me, but we're going to do a little 5 inch sample. And so this is how you would figure out and find out what fabric you want to buy, how much you're going to need. And then of course you can put a little swatch there so you remember what it is when you get home. I bought that red fabric for what purpose? That way you'll know. So let's go, and we're going to talk about all of the different supplies that you're going to need in order to do this. Some of the supplies that you're going to need is you're going to need battleizer, and that is our batting stabilizer combination product. Because this is a quilt and it's also embroidery, you kind of need a combination product, and that's our battleizer product. So you will need that, and you will also need some water-soluble thread. And if you're not familiar as to why you would need thread that washes away, we'll talk about that as we use it when we make the block. The other thing that is pretty much required is a hoop scissors mini and also hoop scissors. And both of these scissors are just their offset handle. That one's upside down. And they just help you get in the hoop. This is great for trimming applique, and this one is also wonderful for just cutting if you need to cut into a 1/4 inch seam on any of your seams as you're making this. And the other essential tool is our Trimmer by George tool. And as you can see, it's an acrylic ruler, but it also has a metal crimped edge. So that metal crimped edge is what you tuck into your block underneath the fabric on the front, and then you will need a 60mm rotary cutter to trim the backing and also the battleizer away. And by doing that, when you join your blocks to another block, that bulk is gone in the seam allowance. So those are just some basic things that you will need in order to be doing this quilt. And now we'll talk specifically about what you need for the block that we're doing today. Okay, so we are going to stitch out block 3A, and I have all my supplies here that we're going to need. For the thread, you're going to need your choice of thread color for the vine and also for the stems. And so I have two different colors here. Now when we show this block, we're going to do it adding the backing to it. If you decide that you're not adding the backing to it, then there's a slideshow at the end that will show you that. So you would just skip that step. So here's my two colored greens, and because I'm adding the backing, anything that goes on after the backing has to have a matching bobbin. So there's my two greens, and you will also have to have a thread that matches and a thread that contrasts your applique fabric. My applique fabric is going to be red, so here's my match. And I honestly haven't decided if I wanted to do black or white for my contrasting, so I'll decide that when I get there. So definitely the options are open for how you want this to turn out. I'm also going to skip this thread for a second, but this is my wool batting, and as you can see, I've cut it to the size that the instructions tell you, and I've also pressed this along the edges in about 1/4 of an inch. And you prepare your wool like that so that your presser foot does not get caught in the loftiness of that wool. And so let's go over my fabric. This is my applique fabric. Another thing you're going to need is you are going to need, in this particular case, your fabric 1. It tells you to cut a square, and this particular square for the 5-inch happens to be a 5-inch square. And anything that has a blue font to it in your fabric and thread key means that you're supposed to then cut that square on the diagonal. So if you see that, then you'll know what that's for. So I will just need one of these. And then you will also need a larger square of the fabric 1. So there's that. And then with fabric 2, which is going to be my white, I just want to go black, white, and red with this sample. So you're going to need 2 1/4 of an inch, and your instructions will say by WOF. That means by width of fabric. So it's basically 2 1/4 inches by 42 inches long, or whatever the width of the fabric coming off your bolt is. It's usually averages around 42 inches. And then you'll need fabric for the backing if you're doing the backing while it's in the hoop. And your instructions also say for thread, to get quilting thread that matches your fabric 1 and your fabric 2. So that would be my black and white. So let's go over to the machine and we'll get started stitching. Okay, for step 1, I have my design pulled up off my jump drive, and I have my battleizer in the hoop. And make sure that you choose a hoop that is the smallest available that will still fit your design. That will help anything from getting out of place. It's just always a good practice just to always use the smallest hoop possible. So I have my battleizer hooped, and from this step, the first one, you're going to start out with water soluble thread, and what it will do is it'll sew a placement stitch to show where to place our wool if we choose to use the wool. I'm going to stitch this step with light green thread just so that you can see it. And the reason that we use the water soluble is because we want to avoid all that thread buildup on the edge of the block. And now for step 2, you would also continue with the water soluble thread. And actually, I'm going to change to water soluble. Well, we'll leave it green. I just didn't want it showing through my white, but your water soluble will not. So now our block has got a placement stitch, so we know exactly where to place our prepared wool. And in this step, it's going to sew a zigzag stitch to hold the wool in place. So all you have to do is just keep the wool batting lined up with the battleizer, the stitching on the battleizer, and it'll sew that zigzag stitch to hold it there. Now step 3, you're going to continue with your water-soluble thread, and it's going to sew some placement stitches so that you know exactly where to put your fabric. Now again, if I was stitching this out to actually be used in a quilt, I would be using my water-soluble thread, but I'm using the green so that you can see clearly what it's stitching. As you can see, I'm using my finger ahead of the foot to push that wool batting down. And that will help keep the presser foot from getting caught in that batting. So now for step 4, which will also be a water-soluble thread step, you're going to take your fabric 1, your biggest square, and you are going to be placing it right over that triangle in the center. So I'm going to have to move the hoop a little bit to be able to see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to center it and then peek under it just to make sure that all my edges are covered. And that looks great. Now I'll put my hoop back on the machine, and again, this is a water-soluble thread step, but we're going to use green. So now it's going to sew a tack down stitch for step 4. And you just have to make sure that the fabric stays smooth as it's stitching. And then what you'll do is you will trim after step 4 1/4 inch from that stitching, anything that's on the inside of the block. If there is anything on the outside of the block, you will just go ahead and leave that there. Okay, for step 5, you're going to, for the blocks that are 3A and 17A, you're going to be using fabric 2. And if you check out your instructions for the blocks that are 3B and 17B, you will use fabric 1. So my fabric 2 on my block 3A is my white. So you're going to put just a neutral color thread in the needle to sew your seam. I put a white thread in there because if I did anything darker, I didn't want that thread possibly showing through on the white. But I have my neutral thread in there, and now we're going to sew a seam. So I just place my fabric right sides down. Since I have light fabric covering that dark and I don't want the dark to show through, I want to make sure that I did cover that sufficiently, that black fabric. And let's sew our seam. Okay, so I'm going to clip a couple little thread tails in here, and I'm going to continue with the same color thread. Before we go on, I'm going to flip this fabric right side up and I'm going to finger press. Just finger press it right on that seam and then smooth that out. For step 6, we're going to do a seam over here on this side. So hopefully you guys can see that. I am going to also cut the selvage off my strip. This is where we use our little strip of fabric, the width of the fabric. And we're going to lay it again right sides down, and we're going to make the raw edges even. I'm going to extend a little bit beyond that again just because I don't want my dark fabric showing through, and I'm going to sew the seam. And I'm going to flip this right side up, and I'm going to finger press this as well. Make sure you can see that. I'm going to finger press this side over here. And then I am going to trim it so it's at least a ½ inch past the outside edge of the block. Okay, so I have it nice and finger pressed and laying flat, and now I'm going to do the seam for the bottom edge. So I'll just place that same fabric right side down, raw edges even or a little past so the dark color doesn't show through, and then go ahead and stitch my seam. Okay. And again on the bottom, I'm going to flip this fabric right side up and finger press it. And I'm going to trim over here on the side so that it extends at least a ½ inch past the edge of the block. Okay, so we are on to step 8. Now step 8 is where we're going to add our backing fabric. And again, if you've chosen to back your quilt once you've sewn it into sections and skip adding the backing while it's in the hoop, you would just simply skip over this step and go to step 9. But I'm going to show you how to do that in this video. I see a thread, drives me crazy. So what you're going to do is you're going to flip your hoop, take it off the machine. Do not take your block out of the hoop, leave it in the hoop, and make sure you're laying it on a flat surface. The other thing you might want to do is you see any threads back here that maybe you might want to clip. You can go ahead and do that right now. And then you're going to need your backing fabric. So I have my piece of backing fabric, and you're basically just going to center that right over the top of where you see the stitching, and just peek on all the different sides. Make sure you have an even amount of fabric on all those different sides. Now the rough side of the battleizer will make this cling. If not, you could spray maybe a little Sulky KK 2000 to the wrong side of your backing fabric, and that would help get it to stick as well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it back, right side up, making sure everything stays in place. I'm also going to peek under to make sure that it didn't shift. And now we're going to go ahead and sew just a basting stitch. And we are going to use water-soluble thread, but the basting stitch will hold the fabric in the front in place as well as hold the backing fabric on the back of the block. All right, I have my hoop placed back on the machine and my backing fabric underneath and water-soluble thread in the needle. And we put the water-soluble thread in here because as you sew your blocks together, if you don't sew right on that seam or right on that stitching or on the inside of it when you sew your blocks together, you will have your thread showing. And with it being a wash-away thread, you can just easily get it wet and it'll disappear. So while this is stitching, remember how we finger pressed our seams? You're going to make sure, again, just give it another good finger press. Make sure everything's laying smoothly as it sews around your block. When you get to a section, you may have a couple where they're like uphill, where you have a little flip thing of fabric here. Just maybe take the stylus from your machine. You could use your finger if you're not too close, or your tip of your scissors, and make sure that stays down so that when it stitches, it doesn't catch it and stitch it like that. There, smooth sailing. This is a downhill on this one, so we're good. And just make sure everything's nice and smooth. And there, we now have our edges tacked down and our backing is attached to the back of the block. Step 9 is a quilting step, and what you're going to do on all your blocks is for this step the first quilting step is you're going to match your needle thread with the fabric that's on the inside. So for me it's the black, and if you're adding the backing like we just did, you're going to also have the same thread in the bobbin. If you're going to add your backing later after your sections of your quilt are sewn together, then you can just continue with embroidery bobbin thread. The other thing that you should do here in this step is that you should turn off your automatic thread cutter. That will help reduce the number of bird's nests on the back, and this is really only applies if you already have your backing fabric on there. And the other thing to help make your back look really nice is if you just do needle down and needle up and pull your bobbin thread to the top, and that will help make your back look a lot prettier. So let's sew our quilting. For step 10, it's going to do more quilting, and this time you're going to match your needle thread with the fabric that's on the outside, and your instructions will specifically tell you which thread to use. You may have noticed that there's a little bit of black quilting that came out into the white, and that's okay because this particular block is going to have applique over the top of that. So because it has the applique, it's definitely going to be covering that up. And so now we can get started. Since I have my backing fabric, put it on while it's in the hoop, I've also matched my bobbin thread to my needle thread, and I'm going to pull my bobbin thread up, and then we're going to do some more quilting. Just gonna cut my thread tail. Step 11 is this green vine or ribbon that flows through the entire quilt. So I chose a green color, and again I matched my bobbin thread because I have the backing fabric on there. Again, if you choose to do your backing later in sections, you can just continue with embroidery bobbin thread. And basically what we're going to do here is I'm just going to bring the needle down, needle up, and bring that bobbin thread to the top. One thing you should note is on your instruction there is a place for you to write what color thread you use, because this will be the same color all throughout the quilt from block to block. So it's good to note it on this step right here on your instructions. A very light stitching. It definitely looks like an organza ribbon flowing through the quilt. Step 12 is it's the leaves and the vines for the flower. So I've just put in a darker shade of green, and I will let it stitch the embroidery on my block. For step 13, we're going to be stitching a placement stitch using water-soluble thread, and it's a placement stitch for the flower applique. For step 14, you're going to need your piece of applique fabric, and you're going to put thread in your needle that matches that fabric, and then you're going to place the fabric centered right over the top of the placement stitches, and just peek underneath, make sure all your edges are covered. And the reason we're matching our applique fabric is because it is, instead of water soluble, is because it is going to do a little flower detail on top of that fabric. Just hold it in place with your fingers. Keep it smoothed out, at least the first time around, so there's no puckers. And then the second go around, it'll add that flower detail. Now you're just going to take your Hoop Scissors Mini and you're going to trim as close to the stitching on the applique as you can. Just make sure you're laying your hoop on a flat surface so that you don't accidentally pop your block out of the hoop. And now we're going to just put this back on the machine and it'll sew the satin stitches. For step 16, which is our final step, you are to put a contrasting thread on the needle and in the bobbin if you already have your backing fabric on. And it's going to stitch some flower detail and a cute stitching over the top of the satin stitch. So just a reminder, if you have your backing already down, it's a good idea to do needle down, needle up, and bring that bobbin thread to the top before you begin. Okay, so I have finished this block and it looks pretty cool, especially in the sunlight. And so now we're going to talk about trimming the blocks. In our quilts and in all of our quilts, if there is a side of the block that's going to have binding sewn to it, you will trim that edge 1/4 inch from that basting stitch through all the layers. But if a side of your block is going to be joined to another block, you need to remove the bulk. So what that means, it means that our battleizer and our backing fabric needs to be trimmed right up to that basting stitch. And that's where the trimmer by George comes in, because just a regular rotary cutter and ruler or a scissors is going to end up nicking the fabric that you're going to need as your seam. So the trimmer by George that has this metal edge to it is what you slide underneath the fabric on the front. Just shimmy it up there. Give a gentle tug, but just take a look and make sure that there is no fabric peeking out. And if there isn't, then you can use your 60mm rotary cutter and the metal edge as your straight edge and cut away the battleizer and the backing fabric. That way there's going to be no bulk in the seam. So let me just do that again on another side so that you can see how that's done. You're going to lift up your fabric that's on the front, and the metal edge of your trimmer by George is slid in there to protect the edge. Make sure there's no fabric that's showing, and then you can use the metal side as your straight edge and cut it with your 60mm rotary cutter. So I'm going to do one more side, slide that in there, and lay your ruler down, check for no fabric, and cut away the battleizer and the backing fabric. And just for another review also, if this is the side where you're going to have binding, so it's the edge of your quilt, then you don't have to worry about the metal edge, and you can just place the 1/4 inch mark right on top that basting stitch and cut through all the layers. So then what's left then is obviously the fabric, which now needs to be trimmed. So you will just cut that fabric on the front down to 1/4 inch from that basting stitch. So we'll go all the way around, then our block will be ready to go. Okay, so there's our totally trimmed out block. And again, we have 3 sides that are trimmed to be joined to another block, and 1 side that is the edge of the quilt, or the binding edge. So you have to have that there so that you have something to sew the binding to. So that's your basic trimming lesson. This particular block, you're going to have to check and see where all your blocks are located in the quilt, and you'll have to make sure that you trim the binding edge like we showed you here, or you still have everything there.
And that is the end of this video, so we'll just show you some pictures of our other quilt with different colorway, and we hope you enjoyed this video, and please contact us at info@HoopSisters if you have any questions about this or any other block. Thanks for watching.